Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our guest today is James I. Porter, the author of The Invention of Dionysus, an essay on the birth of tragedy. What a title and what a book. This was a lot of fun. But what attracted me to your book, The Invention of Dionysus, is the convergence of several complex problems not previously studied, taken into account in previous readings of the work. So there's a large way to start off. Where would you go?
I think what what really draws me to this work is the fact that it continues to exert this kind of appeal to us even today, and this is puzzling. I was teaching a seminar on Nietzsche a couple of years ago, and my first question to the students was, why is it that you're so interested in Nietzsche? He's, after all, a closet figure from the 19th century. He should be full of dust and cobwebs. What is the attraction? And he really does come from the 19th century world, and we seem to have lost touch with that context. So Nietzsche's Dionysian shimmering world of Dionysus seems to afford us the same kinds of attractions as it did to the early 20th century followers of Nietzsche. In some way, we still then are 19th century Victorian readers, and it's a bit strange. You know, it's an odd way of imagining ourselves. But so the mystery of the Dionysian to the modern world, its attraction, its fascination, the fascination that it exerts on us, is something that has to be looked into and critiqued. I think that's part of what I'm trying to do with the book, to puncture through some of the illusions that the Dionysian seems to promise to us, this kind of illusory hope of a transcendence beyond, the rational, the cognitive.
Is it something that the students, because I've noticed that too, that the students seem really fascinated. Is it the element of power, of how you use it, and then you bring in the Dionysian and Apollonism as different aspects of that? Is it, and in this country we have the sense of a mega power, and so we're looking for this rationale, or what?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most telling critiques that Nietzsche makes of power, it's not a word that he uses very much in this work, but it's true that I think you're right that most people read the birth of tragedy in the hindsight of his later works. For instance, his theory of the will to power, and they believe that somehow, because he later helps us reinterpret what he did in 1872 in this book as a precursor to his theory of the will to power. He makes a comment somewhere that what attracts us to power is the very lack of a kind of lack in ourselves. So what is fascinating about the will to power ought to be the deficiency of power rather than the possession of it. Anybody who instantiates the will to power is probably not going to be reading Nietzsche's books. So then who is he writing for? And what fascination is he exploring in his audience and possibly exposing? So in some way, Nietzsche's operating a kind of he's operating a kind of rhetorical critique that upends readers' expectations, if only they're willing to catch it, to see it. So as I said, the Dionysian represents a kind of shimmering promise of some transcendental beyond, a metaphysical escape from the world. And it's that promise that I think needs to be explored and looked at, and to see how it's developed in his work, in this particular work. And ultimately, I don't think that it stands up. It's deflated in the end.
Is that why you use the word invention of Dionysus?
Precisely.
It's really an artificial construct.
Yes.
And then as maybe you can answer that part of it, because there's also, as you were talking, I was remembering the issue of appearances linked up with that. And so.
That's right. Yeah. Well, there is this basic problem in the book, which is if the Dionysian realm is beyond appearances, then how do we have access to it? And so it seems that the only way that we can actually gain access to the Dionysian realm is through the realm of appearances. Nietzsche makes more or less that kind of claim when he's saying that the Apollinian is what allows us to glance as if from a distance. It protects us from, but also gives us a glimpse into this beyond. Well, if you follow the logic far enough along, you find that, in fact, the Dionysian can only exist as an appearance, that it's available to us only through appearances, and ultimately it may be nothing more than an appearance. And it was at that point in my thinking when I just came across this, this particular idea, I realized that there's something rather fishy about Dionysianism. That is to say, it's too easy, too accessible, in fact, almost too cliched and too available. And it is that because it's precisely, it conforms to 19th century romantic ideologies about what we could say are kind of escapism of some sort. So invention of Dionysus refers to the fact that Dionysus is in many ways, in Nietzsche's book, an invention of the very realm that he's supposed to represent a liberation from, that's to say, the Apollinian realm itself. And at one level, and you mentioned layers, and I think that we have to talk about different narrative approaches to Dionysus because there's no one way to really unwrap him. In one respect, Dionysus is simply, we could say, a mythical invention of the Greeks themselves. And that's to say, a product of an aesthetic regime that Apollo represents, and therefore an invention of the Apollinian regime. Ultimately, I believe Nietzsche collapses these two realms, Apollo and Dionysus, in favor of some other, he exposes them in favor of some other mechanism that's going on in Greek culture. But at the level of mythography, if you like, Dionysus turns out to be, in narrative terms, nothing more than an invention of the Apollinian realm, of the realm of appearances, of aesthetics.
It's almost a convenience, that you extract sometimes out of previous cultures' mythology, something that's convenient to bring in, and then you really, when you do that and insert it into your own culture, you've, like you said, invented something that didn't exist before, and may not have all the trappings that it had back in the previous context.
Right. Sure. Okay. So that's true. I mean, Nietzsche, on another level, Nietzsche is operating an enormous anachronism, and that's a separate strand within his narrative, and one could unpack that separately. What I was referring to just now was the fact that even within the logic of Greek mythology, according to Nietzsche's own narrative, Dionysus is already an invention of the Greeks themselves. And then that invention there in ancient Greece seems to mirror some trait about our modernity. And so at that level, yes, then the anachronism becomes significant of a larger critique that Nietzsche's making, insofar as he's asking us, how gullible are we as an audience, as a modern audience, to believe in this kind of mythology? What is it that attracts us to the Greeks? What's the compulsion? I think that Nietzsche is exploring this fascination through our own possible fascination with the Dionysian. He's exploring a fascination with something which is non-modern, archaic, primitive, which obviously has roots in contemporary culture, and he's exploring that kind of ideology.
And he's looking at in the sense of the requirements, I guess that's not quite the right word, for tragedy to occur, or to be something to be interpreted as tragic.
The official reading of tragedy for Nietzsche would be this confluence of these two forces, a balancing of the Apollinian Dionysian forces in Greek culture at a unique moment, after which there's a falling off, a decline, a degeneracy, which leads into the modern degenerate world, which is waiting for a rebirth of the very same conditions that led to the tragic phenomenon, a Gesamtkunstwerk that's represented by Wagner, for instance. So he's pointing ahead to what, some future rebirth of a Greek moment. Right, so that's, if you look a little bit more closely at Nietzsche's narrative, it turns out that it's difficult to find a high point in classical drama. That's to say, it's hard to find that very moment where drama begins to fall off. Officially, Euripides is the downfall of Greek drama. He represents a Socratic tendency in Greek thought that's completely cognitive and is baffled before something that exceeds the capacities of reason. And Euripides being the third of the great tragedians in the chain of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, he represents the decisive degeneracy of Greek drama, the end of the dramatic form. However, there are problems with this particular narrative because it turns out that Sophocles, for instance, was, if you look at what Nietzsche says, Sophocles seems to have ushered in the fall of tragedy simply by having written a treatise about the dramatic form, which is already stepping into the world of intellect and away from the world of production, creative production. And he seems to have, at the same time, changed the function of the chorus and the balance of the relationship of the chorus to the actors. So that particular narrative does not hold up. In the case of Sophocles, it turns out that Sophocles seems to have been, at least if you look at him by himself, he seems to be the source of the degeneration of drama, which by itself is a conundrum. How could he possibly be the high point as well as the low point of drama? And at every single stage that you can trace this decline, it turns out that we can track the decline back to the drama of Aeschylus, who already seems to have inaugurated a period of skepticism towards Greek divinity. Those are the word skepticism towards divinity. Those are Nietzsche's own terms. And he seems to have exerted an influence on Sophocles as well. And if we go back further, we find that a foreboding of the decline of Greece is already to be found even in Homer. In the case of, for instance, Achilles, who's mourning his own existence, his own heroic existence.
One of the things that interested me is the various comments you had in your book about metaphysics and Nietzsche, and how it's much more pervasive than what previously had been thought.
Right. I do think that one of the ways in which Nietzsche has not been well served by interpreters is that we tend to overestimate his liberation from metaphysical thinking in his later thought, and to underestimate his liberation from metaphysical thinking in his earlier thought. In fact, I think that at no time in his career did Nietzsche really believe that metaphysics was something that metaphysical thinking was something one could simply dismiss as if that one could free oneself definitively from metaphysical thinking. So, first question might be, well, what is metaphysical thinking? And for the time being, we can say that it simply represents a thinking in terms of contrasts between essences and appearances, or the belief in some sort of essential truth. And it's a controversial claim, but it's not hard to bear out that Nietzsche's own thinking, even his so-called theory of the will to power later on, is itself a version of metaphysical thinking. Most people who are exponents of Nietzscheanism, and I think this is an interesting phenomenon by itself, that Nietzsche doesn't simply have interpreters, but he has almost developed a kind of church, a pious church in which people come and reverently.
Church of Nietzsche.
Absolutely, and it's very hard to get any kind. I mean, it makes everybody has his own Nietzsche, of course, but people tend to break down into categories. Readers of Nietzsche tend to break down into either absolute believers in Nietzsche or absolute vilifiers of Nietzsche, and this is, a phenomenon that has to be examined in its own right. So I coined this term, metaphysical recidivism, which I think captures pretty much what Nietzsche is up to, as far as I can tell, from his earliest writings in the 1860s down to his later writings in the 1880s, and that is that he believes that metaphysics, and I think here he's following Schopenhauer, seems to be a pervasive need. The need to think in terms of metaphysical contrasts is so deeply rooted in us that there's no escaping it. It's part of our grammar. It's part of the way we think about the world. So willy-nilly, the very attempt to escape from metaphysics is going to land us, if this is correct, back into metaphysical thinking, and that would include the will to power. So one thing that's interesting about Dionysianism in the early Nietzsche, in the Nietzsche of 1872, The Birth of Tragedy, is that it's, on the one hand, it seems to represent a break from a good deal of Western metaphysical thinking. On the other hand, it reintroduces metaphysics in a very big way in the figure of Dionysus, who represents a kind of metaphysical thing in itself, and in no way seems to represent an escape. Well, that's true. I think here Nietzsche, you had asked earlier about Lange, here Nietzsche is following a very interesting insight of Lange's, which is that precisely essences turn into what appears as an essence on one level turns into an appearance on another level. That there's a constant conversion of essence and appearance as we go searching for some greater, deeper essence or essential being. And so Nietzsche is illustrating that through his various conceptual flip-flops that he runs us through in this book and in other parts of his work too.
I thought that was interesting. Throughout the book, you're kind of sifting through these different things, trying to avoid excesses. I mean, you point out Maurice Blanchot's, you know, how he even epitomizes an entire tradition of that misses out on the character of Nietzsche's style.
Yes.
And so there's this thing of going through and saying, well, it's not quite that much. You might look at this element of it.
Yeah, I did try to introduce a kind of sobriety to the thinking about Nietzsche, and so I guess in that sense, a non-Dionysian approach to Nietzsche's writing, but which is not to say an Apollinian approach by any means. But I think that Nietzsche was if you could allow the expression, insanely sane. He was. Freud once says that there was no way that you could actually analyze Nietzsche because he had a better grasp of himself than anyone possibly could, and including Freud himself. Nietzsche is thoroughly aware of what he's doing. I think we have to credit him with this kind of self control and also unlimited ability to doubt any truth, any final truth, including any truth that might be considered to be Nietzschean. Nietzsche would be the last person to say, I'm a Nietzschean. And the way Marx said, je suis pas Marxiste, Nietzsche would say, I'm not at all a Nietzschean, unlike many of his readers. So yes, if I succeeded in trying to bring out some of the intense sanity, the dangerous sanity of Nietzsche's thought, which verges on a kind of ecstasy of sanity, if you like, or the madness of the reasons which are working through Nietzsche's thought, then that's certainly the case. Yes, yeah.
Well, and there were several different things where you explore this, the complication of appearances, and then the notion of masks, and the place behind or beneath or beyond.
Yes. Well, yeah, a good example of that is this famous notion of the veil of Maya, which he inherits from Schopenhauer. The veil of Maya is Schopenhauer's and Nietzsche's in this book signature for basically the world of appearances, which protects us from a beyond, but also allows us to glimpse into it. What I mean by the complication of appearances is that the following experiment: what is it that allows some sense of a transgressive beyond to appear to us? And it's not that so much that there's something that's shimmering through the veil of appearances, but rather that there's a wrinkle in appearances itself that casts a false shadow. And that shadow we understand as something which lies beyond, but in fact it isn't. A good example of that going back to the Möbius band, which is one way of saying what's inside seems to be, in fact, just surface. So what appears to be deep and beyond, it turns out to be something which is available on the surface only, is the story of Zeuxis and Parrhasius, these two Greek painters who had a rivalry going. And Zeuxis famously painted pictures of grapes, which birds went after and tried to eat. And Parrhasius, when he learned about this trick of verisimilitude, tried to outwit Zeuxis, invited him over to his studio to look at a painting. And Zeuxis came and saw the painting, and it was all he saw was a veil. And he said, well, okay, that's great. Show me the painting. Well, the painting turned out to be the veil, and he tried to lift the veil, and there was nothing to see. Well, this gesture of concealing nothing, or concealing the fact that there is nothing to conceal, is precisely what the complication of appearances does. And that's another way of phrasing what I think the invention of Dionysus is. It's precisely the invention of an appearance of a beyond, when in fact there is no beyond. There's nothing behind the surface. And Nietzsche's question at this point is, what makes us want to pursue this shadow to beyond the surface? What is it that allowed the Greeks to come up with this notion of a kind of beyond? And what is it about the moderns that makes us also so avid in our pursuit, in our desire to get beyond the surface of appearances? And it's that psychological trait which goes back to metaphysical recidivism and the need for metaphysics that Nietzsche's exposing.
And another concept was the physiology of dreams.
Oh, yeah.
As an element.
Yes. Right. At the very beginning, Nietzsche does mention that there is something about dreams, which is the realm of appearances. It's where we first have a sensation of a beyond. And he puts it in the following terms. It's that vague twilight moment of consciousness when we wake up and we have an awareness that we're dreaming. We say, I like the dream, I want to dream further. This doubling of appearances there, the doubling of the desire to continue dreaming, is a strong Apollinian impulse for Nietzsche. But the term he uses in this case, the physiology of dreams, reminds us of the Greek term physiologia. And in fact, he's quoting from Lucretius. He mentions Lucretius, the Roman translator of Epicurean atomism, who in fact brings us back to Democritus, as a source for this view that the Greeks in their dreams saw gods. Well, this opens up a very large topic in Nietzsche's thinking, because he had done a good deal of work on Democritus and Epicureanism and atomism in antiquity, and this interest in atomism is something that he pursues all the way into the 1880s when he's working on The Will to Power. Something troubling about seeing an atomist in a treatise that's supposedly devoted to ideal metaphysics. And so this is one of the clues that something's amiss here in Nietzsche's narrative, and so it's that combination that I think you asked about at the beginning of Lange, materialism, Democritus, a critique of Schopenhauer, a critique of Schopenhauer through Plato, and we haven't talked about that yet, but that's important. These strands converge into, there's like red flags that come up, and we just have to look at them a little bit more closely and find out, what could Lucretius possibly have to do with a view of Greek divinities such as Dionysus. Lucretius, who of all philosophers believed that gods were just simply inventions of the human mind, thought constructs. So if that's the case, then Dionysus has to be as much a thought construct as anything else. So again, we're back to the invention of Dionysus. There seems to be no way of escaping this kind of counter-reading.
And then there was one of my favorites, the delicate boundaries.
Well, what was your favorite? What did you like about that so much?
Just this, that they're not so definite. That they really are more mutable and permeable than what we think, and that in a way, is almost an illusion that there are these definite
Precisely.
points.
Yeah. And I think Delicate Boundaries perhaps is a good way of translating a good deal of Nietzsche's thinking in this particular work, because there are boundaries that are fluid all the way through it. There's no way that he can actually that we can maintain a distinction firmly enough. There's no way to maintain firm distinctions in Nietzsche's thinking in general, and particularly here, in a work which seems to be set up by contrasts. The contrasts begin to flow together in a very disturbing way.
And I think your approach picks up that, whereas a strong advocate will say, well, this definitively must, whatever. So I thought that's what fascinated me about that concept. As you point out in your book, even as you examine the fastidious fascination that tragedy exerts with being in control of death, you notice that Nietzsche unpacks the multiple layerings of artistic creation that compose Socrates, the narrative frames that radiate out an embedded discourse, and the inset temporal recesses concealing somewhere beneath all the folds and husks the historical Socrates. So here's a chance to address the Socrates and Plato. I should say, I continue, concealing somewhere beneath all the folds and husks the historical Socrates like some marvelous fruit. What a wonderful phrase. Could you unpack this site into the Socratic fallacy that Nietzsche talks about?
Sure. Well, there is a huge problem in, as you probably know, in Platonic scholarship in trying to isolate who Socrates is. And Socrates seems to be, in some ways, an aesthetic invention of Plato, and in other ways, getting at the historical Socrates has always been a conundrum. Nobody's succeeded in getting through the layers of narration in Plato that make him up. A good example of that would be Nietzsche's favorite dialogue, which is the Symposium, which is written in what is called indirect discourse, which means that we have quotes within quotes within quotes, and Socrates ends up being this final quotation mark.
So the key word in the title of your book is the word invention, as much as anything.
Probably, yeah.
Is that
Oh, yeah.
this is a constructed...
Well, yes, I'd also say essay, because it's simply an attempt to come to terms with something
Right.
which is extremely hard to parse. The meanings in this work are very difficult to parse, so it remains a tentative approach.
Well, it's an interesting one, and I had fun reading it and reflecting on it, so thank you for being on Unriprap.
Thank you, too.